Here's a quote directly from, I didn't write down the page number. I'm so sorry. Modern technology has become a total phenomenon for civilization. The defining force of a new social order in which efficiency is no longer an option, but a necessity imposed on all human activity.
Is that Illich?
This is Illich still. Because the characteristics of modern technique are that it's highly rational, it's highly artificial, which those are two things that are obvious. And so he moves through those quickly. But he spends a lot of time talking about how they're automatic, they're self-augmenting, meaning that technique itself, humans, once you have a technology that exists and has been discovered by a genius, is basically the Newton discovers gravity and physics and like this way of approaching physics. Newton discovers it. You don't need geniuses anymore to build on that. The technique itself creates the next step, and humans become, what's the word I'm looking for? Mediators of the process. Drivers. Yeah, exactly. Humans become mediators of a process rather than the agent of a process. And so they're self-augmenting, they're automatic, they're whole. He uses the word monism, which is kind of regrettable because it's too confusing with the rest of philosophy. But the idea being they're universal. There's a universalism, they're whole. The best way to make something here in Boise remains the best way to make it anywhere in the world. The idea that you would get two different swords for the same purposes from different places no longer seems to make any sense. There's a process for making a thing, and you make them. The thing I'm most familiar with is bikes, right? They all basically look the same. Yeah, there are different brands with different components, but the technology is basically identical from one bike to another. If you're looking at the way they shift, you might have like one bike has two gears up front, another one only has one and six in the back or a few in the back. The derailleur that moves the gears is going to look a little bit different, but the process of producing those in a factory most efficiently and in the most cost-effective way is going to be basically the same, with only those simple exterior design things looking a little different because there's branding to be sold, right? And those are not gratuitous add-ons in the same sense that doing a little artistic flourish on the hilt of a sword, or, which we'll get to in 2 weeks, or in the way that in an old manuscript of a book, the first letter of every chapter, they're going to spend 5 hours drawing. That is not the same as putting the Shimano brand on the derailleur on a bike, right? Because that's really just for sales, and it's actually part of the technique of selling a thing, right? So that's the sort of the last piece, is that techniques overlap with one another and they actually create new opportunities. So again, technique is not just about machines, it's about processes. It's the way we approach problems or life in general. And we live in a world for Illich, and I think clearly for Illich, in which technique is the dominating force, under which, what's the bigger point here? Technique is this force that prevents us from having any other realms of life, like any other, maybe prevents us from the other existential necessities of life from being in the fore. I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because I'm thinking of time energy now, right? I hope you guys all know what this is, even if you haven't read the book. I'm not going to sell your book for you. I'm sorry. No. Buy this book. It's actually really good. My copy is destroyed because I was just traveling with it. But the idea that there is an inherent human desire to have the autonomy of our own time and our energy reserves to do things is an I think, in some sense, trying to carve out a space in which technology is not the absolute force that it is. Illich is quick to point out, and this is the problem that Illich faces and that any of us face who take this seriously, if I can find it, that you don't just decide to get rid of technique. And I'll say it simply, but I'll also read, this will be kind of the conclusion of understanding what needs to be understood for a little. If technique is the process of determining what needs to happen and then coming up with the most efficient way to make that happen, if that is what technique is, if we want a world free of technique, we can't just say, that's what we want. How should we best get there? Because then technique is still driving. And it becomes this contradiction. Does that make sense? Technique ultimately can't be the thing that creates the new world. It has to emerge through just a set of situations. So if we're thinking about what are the conditions of possibility for a world in which technology is decentered, not eliminated, that's not the point. This isn't a regressive way of thinking for sure, but where it's not the driving force of every decision in life. The conditions of possibility don't include designing that world. And that is tricky. I think that is really the tricky heart of Illich's work, is trying to get us to think creatively, imaginatively, and sub-create with possibilities and desires, but without spelling out exactly how that looks. A danger he even maybe goes too far in deschooling. Let me read this so you can get a sense for the book if you want to read it. The milieu into which a technique penetrates becomes completely, and often at a stroke, a technical milieu. If a desired result is stipulated, there is no choice possible between technical means and non-technical means based on imagination, individual qualities, or tradition. Nothing can compete with the technical means. The choice is made a priori. It is not in the power of the individual or of the group to decide to follow some method other than the technical. The individual is at a dilemma. Either he decides to safeguard his freedom of choice, chooses to use traditional, personal, moral, or empirical means, thereby entering into competition with the power against which there is no efficacious defense and before which he must suffer defeat, or he decides to attempt technical necessity, in which case he will himself be the victor, but only by submitting irreparably to technical slavery. In effect, he has no freedom of choice. I point out this passage because I'm not a reader of Nick Land, so I'm only commenting as someone who took the course but hasn't been a deep reader of his work. But if you're a pessimist, right, and if you kind of want the world to burn, you could read something like this and go, yes, it is inevitable, right? Particularly looking at the way that information technologies like artificial intelligence have multiplied over just in 2 years. It's been tremendous, right? As an inevitable force that there is nothing you can do about. Illil's not a pessimist, so he thinks that there is a way of approaching this, but it is messy. And I think that's kind of also the mess of Illich's project. People tended to critique Illich for saying, well, why didn't you give us any solutions? And I think he felt tied, like, I can't. The thing I'm advocating for is not something we decide we want and figure out how to get, because then we won't get it. And so the question is, how would it emerge? Or not even how would it emerge? What do we want to emerge? And almost to an extent, how do we live now a little bit like that? Nonetheless, that's still a problem.